Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal in the bitter custody battle unfolding at General Hospital, Michael employed dirty tactics to secure victory, leaving no stone unturned in his quest for control over his children. Drew, on the other hand, had done everything in his power to protect Willow and ensure the case went in her favor. He had fought tirelessly, invoking every legal maneuver and argument to ensure the children's safety, but Michael's underhanded actions would ultimately bring him closer to his goal. Drew, confident that Willow's case was strong enough to prevail in court, made the fatal mistake of thinking that the legal system would be enough to win the day without the interference of outside forces. Little did he know, a far darker scheme was unfolding behind the scenes. Cameron Matheson, in a shocking reveal, disclosed that an elaborate and sinister blackmail plot had been set into motion to manipulate the outcome of the trial. This wasn't Drew's doing, he had no idea what was coming, but a mysterious figure, someone far more powerful than Drew could have anticipated, stepped in to secure Michael's victory. The true architect of this deceit had used blackmail to pressure Judge Eva Heron, ensuring that the final ruling would swing in Michael's favor. In the end, Michael didn't just gain custody of the children, Wiley and Amelia, by virtue of his supposed merit, he did so by corrupting the very system that was supposed to protect their future. It was a chilling revelation that exposed just how far some were willing to go to control the outcome of the case. But Michael's victory came at a cost. The stain of such a dirty win would forever mark his conscience, for the secrets that were hidden in the shadows were now threatening to be dragged into the light. What began as a fight for custody had quickly morphed into something far more dangerous, an intricate web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal that, if revealed, could destroy not just Michael's reputation but his very standing in the eyes of the people who had once trusted him. In his desperate attempt to secure his place in the children's lives, Michael had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As Drew learned of the treachery that had unfolded, the full weight of his failure settled heavily on his shoulders. He had believed that his legal prowess and moral compass would be enough to win the case, that the truth would prevail. But now, the truth itself seemed to be a casualty in a game of power and deceit. The realization that someone else had orchestrated the blackmail, someone who had used his own trust against him, was enough to break him. Drew's worst fears had been realized, his most trusted allies had been pulled into a conspiracy that destroyed everything he had worked for. Willow, too, was left reeling. While Drew had hoped to shield her from the ugliness of the situation, she could no longer remain ignorant of the lengths to which Michael, and those behind him, had gone to manipulate the system. The news that Michael had used a blackmail scheme to secure custody hit Willow like a thunderclap. Her world, which had already been shaken by the legal battle, was now completely undone. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, had used the very system that was supposed to protect their family for his own gain. The revelation shattered whatever faith she had left in him, and as she processed the depth of Michael's betrayal, a feeling of isolation gripped her heart. What was even more difficult for Willow to bear was the fact that she had been complicit, in a way, by placing so much trust in Drew. She had believed in him, believed that he was the one person who would fight for what was right. But now, it seemed that the truth had been buried under layers of lies, and the repercussions of that truth were far greater than anyone had anticipated. For Michael, the victory was hollow. The children, once his ultimate goal, now seemed like a mere prize in a game he hadn't fully understood. The road ahead was fraught with the consequences of his actions, and as the blackmail plot continued to unfold, it was clear that the truth had a way of coming to light, even when one thought it was buried for good. In the coming days, as the dust settled from the courtroom drama, the tension between the parties involved would only escalate. Drew, now more determined than ever, would stop at nothing to ensure that Michael's dirty tactics didn't go unpunished. And Willow, caught in the middle, would have to reconcile the man she loved with the reality of the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. In this twisted game of power, family, and deceit, there would be no easy resolutions, only the slow, painful unraveling of everything that had been built on lies. Drew's sense of humiliation and anger reached new heights as he realized that all of his efforts had been for nothing. The legal battle, which he had fought so fiercely to ensure that Willow and the children were protected, had been completely undermined by Michael's dirty tactics. The revelation of Michael's underhanded actions, the blackmail and manipulation, left Drew reeling. For all the sacrifices he had made, for all the risks he had taken, his trust in the legal system, in his own righteousness, had been shattered in an instant. The guilt was suffocating, and his self-worth crumbled as the full weight of his failure bore down on him. He had believed in the justice of his cause, but in the end, justice had not prevailed. Instead, the deceit and underhanded moves had won the day, and he was left with nothing. As Drew struggled with his failure, Willow found herself drowning in her own feelings of betrayal. The man she had once seen as her protector, the person who had promised to help her, had become nothing more than a pawn in a game far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Drew's attempts to shield her had now backfired, and the truth was clearer than ever: he had been just as ensnared in Michael's manipulation as she had been. For months, she had trusted Drew completely, believing him to be her partner, her equal. But now, those beliefs felt like a lie, and she was left questioning everything she had ever known about him. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Drew, the man she thought she could build a life with, was not the person she had imagined. He had become consumed by his need to win, by the desperation to reclaim something he had lost, and in doing so, he had lost himself. The anger and bitterness inside Drew had turned him into someone she barely recognized, someone who was willing to do anything to destroy Michael, no matter the cost. Willow's trust in him had been a heavy burden all along, and now, as she uncovered the extent of his involvement in this twisted game, she felt the weight of that trust crushing her from within. As the veil of illusion lifted, the weight of Michael's actions also came into focus. Michael, the man she once loved, had orchestrated this entire affair with no regard for the damage it would cause to the people around him. It wasn't just about the custody battle anymore, it was about power, control, and manipulation. Michael's willingness to destroy Drew, to destroy Willow, to destroy everything they had built, in order to get what he wanted, was the ultimate betrayal. The person she had once placed so much faith in was no longer someone she could recognize, and the realization that she had been manipulated by both men left her feeling more alone than ever. For Drew, the agony of seeing Willow suffer as a result of his involvement was a wound he couldn't heal. His sense of betrayal by Michael, by the man he had once trusted as a brother, was something that gnawed at him constantly. He had never imagined that Michael would go this far, that he would manipulate the system so ruthlessly to claim victory. But now, as the battle for custody ended in Michael's favor, Drew couldn't help but feel as though he had lost everything that mattered. The children he had grown so close to, the life he had hoped to build, had all been torn from him in the most brutal of ways. His hatred for Michael grew with each passing day, a deep, consuming rage that twisted his thoughts and clouded his judgment. He no longer just wanted to reclaim his children, he wanted revenge. He wanted to make Michael pay for what he had done to him, to Willow, and to their family. But the more Drew focused on revenge, the more he found himself slipping further into darkness. The anger that had once felt righteous now seemed like a poison, slowly eroding the man he had once been. His obsession with retribution clouded his reasoning, and the more he festered in his hate, the more he distanced himself from any sense of moral clarity. Drew's descent into madness was not sudden, it was a slow, gradual spiral that had begun the moment Michael manipulated the outcome of the trial. His need for justice, for a fair resolution, had been replaced by a thirst for vengeance. And as he found himself alone in the wake of his failure, Drew could not shake the feeling that he had lost his soul in the process. He no longer cared about what was right or wrong, all that mattered was punishing Michael for what he had done, even if it meant sacrificing everything in the process. For Willow, the battle had taken its toll as well. The pain of losing the children, of seeing her life unravel, was a heavy burden to bear. But what weighed on her the most was the knowledge that she had been part of this mess, unknowingly complicit in the games of power and manipulation that had been played around her. The person she had trusted, the person she had hoped would be her partner in this fight, had turned out to be just as lost in the chaos as she was. As Drew and Willow faced the reality of their shattered lives, they each grappled with their own version of despair. Drew was consumed by the bitterness of betrayal, and Willow was trapped in the aftermath of broken trust. Their relationship, once founded on love and mutual respect, now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh truths of the world they found themselves in. Neither could turn back, and the future seemed uncertain at best. Drew's obsession with vengeance would be his undoing, and Willow's attempt to rebuild her life would be fraught with the scars of the past. Neither would emerge from this ordeal unscathed, and the only certainty they had was that they were both trapped in a world where the lines between right and wrong had long been blurred by betrayal, manipulation, and the pursuit of power. As the walls around Willow began to crumble, she was confronted with an agonizing truth about Drew, the man she had once entrusted with her heart. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, each layer of deceit tearing through her trust, leaving her gasping for air. Drew, the person she had believed was her partner in every sense of the word, the man who had promised to fight for her and their future, was now revealed as someone she barely recognized. All the moments she had shared with him, all the promises he had made, were now tainted by the shadows of his actions. Every loving glance, every tender touch, seemed like a cruel joke in light of the truth. She had given him everything, and now she was left with nothing but betrayal. The more Willow uncovered about Drew's involvement in the twisted game of manipulation and deceit, the more her world began to shatter. It was as if the very foundation of her life was crumbling beneath her feet, and she had no way of stopping it. She had always prided herself on being a devoted mother, someone who could protect her children from the dangers of the world. But now, she was faced with a reality where she had no control. Her life was spiraling out of control, and the more she tried to hold on to the pieces, the more they slipped through her fingers. Her heart ached not only for the children she was fighting for, but also for herself. She had given so much of herself to Drew, to their future, and now she was left with the painful truth that she had been deceived. As the layers of Drew's dark secrets continued to unfold, Willow felt the weight of each revelation press down on her, suffocating her ability to move forward. She had trusted him with her children, with her future, and with her heart. But now, she was forced to see him for what he truly was. A man who was willing to sacrifice everything for his own gain, someone whose ambition had blinded him to the very things that should have mattered the most. The life they had built together was nothing more than a fragile facade, and the cracks that had once been invisible were now clear for all to see. Every moment she had spent with Drew, every shared dream, every whispered promise, felt like a betrayal in itself. Willow couldn't escape the gnawing sense of betrayal that tore through her. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How could Drew have allowed this to happen? How could he have betrayed her trust in such a way? She had always believed in the good in him, in the man who had shown her tenderness and care. But now, she was beginning to question whether that man had ever truly existed or if he was just a figment of her hopes and dreams. She had been so blinded by her love for him that she hadn't seen the signs of his descent into darkness, hadn't realized the extent of his involvement in the manipulation that had destroyed her life. Now, she was left with a gaping hole where trust once resided, and it seemed impossible to ever fill it again. The more Willow tried to make sense of the situation, the more she found herself drowning in a sea of confusion and pain. How could she have been so blind? How could she have been so naive? She had trusted Drew with her heart, her children, her life, and now she was paying the price for that trust. Every decision she had made, every step she had taken, now seemed like a mistake, a step further into a life she hadn't chosen. She was caught in a web of lies, manipulated by Drew, by Michael, and by the very system she had hoped would protect her. And as the truth continued to reveal itself, she couldn't help but feel like she was losing herself in the process. The future that Willow had once envisioned for herself and her children was now nothing more than a distant memory, a dream that had slipped through her fingers like sand. The reality she was faced with was cold, unforgiving, and full of uncertainty. She had no idea what to do next, no idea how to rebuild the life that had been torn apart by betrayal. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in this broken shell of a life any longer. The truth had shattered everything, and the woman she had once been seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone unrecognizable. As Willow grappled with the fallout of Drew's actions, the question remained, could Drew stop himself before he descended any further into madness? The rage that had built up inside him, the thirst for revenge against Michael and anyone else he deemed responsible for his downfall, was consuming him. Drew was no longer the man he once was. The darkness had overtaken him, and every move he made seemed to be driven by a desire to destroy, to tear down everything in his path. The more he fed into his hatred, the more he lost himself in the process. Could he still recognize the man he had once been? Or was he too far gone to return from the abyss? For Drew, the fight was no longer about the children, no longer about doing what was best for them. It had become a battle of wills, a war between him and Michael, a fight for control, for power, for retribution. His obsession with winning, with proving himself right, had clouded his judgment, and he was now locked in a cycle of destruction that seemed impossible to break. Every time he thought he had control, he found himself spiraling further into a world of vengeance and chaos. For Willow, the future seemed bleak and uncertain. The truth had come too late to save her from the devastation that had already been caused. She was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer resembled the one she had once dreamed of. The children she had fought so hard for were now caught in the crossfire of a battle they never asked to be part of. And as Drew and Willow both faced the consequences of their actions, it was clear that their lives had been irrevocably changed. In the end, it was impossible to know whether Drew could ever redeem himself or whether Willow would ever be able to trust again. What was certain, however, was that Michael, despite his victory, would soon find himself facing the consequences of his actions. The web of lies, blackmail, and manipulation that he had woven around them all would eventually unravel, and when it did, no one would emerge unscathed. The battle for control had taken everything from them, and what remained would be a painful reminder of the high price they had paid for their choices. As the dust settled on the battlefield of betrayal, it became clear that the lives of Drew, Willow, and Michael would never be the same. What began as a simple fight for custody had spiraled into a whirlwind of lies, manipulation, and shattered trust. Drew, once a man full of hope and integrity, had become consumed by his need for vengeance, blinded by his anger and the desire to right the wrongs he believed had been done to him. Willow, once full of love and trust, was left to pick up the pieces of a broken life, grappling with the painful truth that the man she had trusted most had betrayed her in ways she never thought possible. For Michael, his victory had come at a heavy cost. Though he had won the battle for custody, the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the dark methods he had used to secure it. The fallout from his actions had only just begun, and the consequences of his betrayal would haunt him in ways he could not yet comprehend. The tangled web of lies he had spun was now beginning to unravel, and the future seemed uncertain for him as well. As Drew and Willow stood at the crossroads of their lives, the road ahead seemed bleak. For Drew, the obsession with revenge had clouded his judgment, and whether he could ever return from the darkness that had consumed him was uncertain. Willow, meanwhile, found herself lost in the aftermath of shattered dreams, unsure of how to rebuild the life that had been torn apart. They were both left to face the painful reality that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. In the end, the only certainty was that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The choices they made, the paths they had taken, would define their futures in ways they could not yet understand. The scars of this battle would remain long after the dust had settled, a reminder of the devastating cost of betrayal, manipulation, and the pursuit of power. The war for the children had taken everything from them, and now they must each find a way to live with the consequences of their actions.